Hey, thanks very much for doing this. I really appreciate your time, man.
I'm trying to remember. Oh, I think didn't you do an interview with Van Dyke Parks?
I did. I had Van Dyke on twice.
And he told me that it was fun.
Oh, did
So
he? Oh, wow.
yeah.
That's amazing. I was actually talking to Van Dyke the other day. He said he's off to Japan. He's doing a few concerts in Japan, which is pretty cool.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah,
Very
yeah, yeah.
nice.
I love Van Dyke, especially his records, and I love the stuff he did with the Mighty Sparrow. And yeah, guy's a legend.
Yeah, yeah. No, he's a great character, and I've it's just one. I don't know. There's a lot of people that I knew back in the '70s in LA when I lived there that I haven't stayed in touch with, but for some reason, Van Dyke and I have always stayed in touch, and I always see him when I go to LA.
Oh, really?
You know, yeah. Well, he
Wow.
he came to my book reading. I did a reading in LA at a bookstore in October, and of course he was there. And the last time we were there, my wife and I we had lunch with him and his wife, and went to the Pasadena Art Museum, and you know stuff.
That's class, man. Yeah, Van Dyke, he's so underappreciated. Like, I think a lot of people just kind of know him for the Brian Wilson stuff and Beach Boy stuff, but like his music's incredible. Like Song Cycle, I love Song Cycle and Jump and Discover
Yeah,
America,
yeah.
just brilliant stuff.
And I mean, I mean, it's kind of a classic in a way, because I think the big work of his life, the thing that he really put the most, I don't know, belief and desire, or one of the most amounts of belief and desire into was Jump.
Oh, I love Jump, man.
Do you know
That is
what Jump
amazing,
is? Yeah.
amazing.
And but Jump was a classic. It came, I think Mo Austin was ready to back it, and but it just came at that moment when the sort of political correct winds were starting to blow, and somehow the cultural context of the source material, the Uncle Remus tales. When I was a kid in America, we loved, I had my uncle, used to take me on his lap and read me from the Uncle Remus book, and it was considered a treasure, a cultural treasure in America. But by the 1970s, whoa, it was tricky.
Okay, okay. Why was that?
And I think, well, because it was a white writer writing in black patois,
Okay, okay. Because I don't really know
black
the story.
folk.
I just okay,
Well,
okay.
it's all these stories. Uncle Remus was like an archetypal, benign slave or servant
Right, right.
who would tell stories to the white kids from the black folktale legacy.
Mhm.
So, I mean, it was the kind of thing that was considered normal in a way, and even liberal, you know, in the 100 years ago. And they were wonderful books, Uncle Remus stories. They were for kids, and like life lessons that we learned as kids, from the Tar Baby. I don't know if that was part of what you heard in Van Dyke's thing, but the Tar Baby is the most famous story of, um, I don't know, somehow the bad guy, the fox, or somebody is provoked into hitting the Tar Baby, and he can't get his fist out. It's like get stuck. So it's like, the fruits of mindless aggression are brought home anyway. It's full of little life lessons. They're wonderful things, but you have to navigate a tricky racial
Okay,
cultural
okay.
minefield to kind of no nobody buys their kids Uncle Remus books today.
Is it kind of cultural appropriation kind of thing? Is why people don't buy them, or just is there kind of racial
Well,
undertones?
no,
Or
just I think just the sort of dynamic of the whole situation is just uncomfortable for people because this ideal of the, I think for a lot of America in the years after the Civil War, after, the abolition of slavery,
Hmm.
there was a kind of, there's so many songs. It's like songs like Swanee, How I Miss You, My Dear Old
Yeah,
Swanee.
yeah.
And like I want to go home, like this sort of nostalgia that I think people, white Southerners and white Northerners, had trouble dealing with the sudden arrival of millions of black people in northern cities in the after the 1900s, and and there were so many songs. There's like, I don't know, 100 songs. It's a treat to beat your feet on the Mississippi mud. These songs of nostalgia for the old South. Like,
Okay.
there's no heart and soul in the big city. I want to go home to my grandma's cabin in the pines. And this idea that black people actually were nostalgic for the South, when in fact they couldn't wait to get the hell out.
All right.
And and uh, um, and there was this whole kind of an industry, a cottage industry in a way, around painting a nostalgic picture of life in the South, where the kids were raised by a black mammy with her head tied up in a kerchief, and
Okay.
who was wonderful to them. And then her husband, the old Uncle Remus, would read stories, would tell tales to the kids at night, and they'd all sit there and listen with wide eyed to these tales of,
Okay.
which are very African, those tales, those Uncle Remus tales. And they're great, but you know, they were from another time and another place and another
Yeah.
agenda.
I didn't know anything about that Uncle Remus stuff. I just love that record because of the music, the
Yeah,
orchestrations on it. It's kind of, I asked Van Dyke Park, I was like, why didn't you do the orchestrations? And he was saying, the guy who did them, I think it's Lenny, I forget his
Lenny
name.
Waronker.
I don't think,
No,
what's it
no,
Lenny?
no,
No, it
no,
wasn't
no,
Lenny
no,
Waronker.
no, not Lenny wouldn't have done it anyway.
No, it was,
But I think
anyways.
there was there was a moment when money was going to be raised to launch it on Broadway,
All right.
or, or in the theater. It was a theater piece.
Yeah, yeah, it's very musical kind of sounding.
Yeah, and it would have been a fantastic musical, but it ran up. By the time it really got to that stage, it was beginning to be tricky.
Okay. I
And I
always thought it
think
was about
when the
Peter Rabbit.
money,
The cover's got a
yeah,
rabbit.
yeah,
I
well,
thought it was about Peter
but
Rabbit.
well, Peter Rabbit or Brer Rabbit, it's Brer Rabbit.
Brer Rabbit, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, Brother Rabbit.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Brer is like Afro-American dialect,
Okay, okay.
like bro,
Ah,
you know,
okay.
Brer, brother. Um, anyway, so there's all sorts of cultural subtext. And Van Dyke, who is the most left-wing guy you can imagine,
Yes.
he's not at all
No.
a reactionary, not by any means, but he just loved the story. I think he grew up listening to those stories. Somebody
Hmm.
read him those stories, and they're wonderful material. But I think I don't know. Anyway, it never got to Broadway.
Yeah. Oh, that's a shame. That's a shame.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Anyway, back to your
yeah.
book, man. That book is there's so much. I think I kind of have to read it twice because there's so much stuff in it. Like it's packed. I love the stuff when you got into about Indian music. 'Cause I love Ravi Shankar and all that kind of stuff. Just
Right, right.
brilliant stuff. And it was kind of interesting to hear how he would get up at like 4 o'clock in the morning and play for like 3 hours. Like that was
Before
yeah,
breakfast,
before
yeah.
breakfast. It just crazy. Like it's just amazing. And
Well,
yeah.
I think one of the subtexts that I don't really hammer this subtext home, but I mean the amount of rehearsing
Mm.
that people did, the amount of practice, the amount of skill that is required to make a lot of this great music from the last century,
Yeah.
um, and um, and how, in a way, it's great and democratizing that people can now buy a computer and put together a track layer by layer and doodle around on it until they get it right.
Yeah.
But it's like it's a different world than the discipline that was required to master Indian Hindustani classical music.
Mm, mm, mm. And it's a completely different way of playing than Western music. Like they have ragas and stuff like that, and with just
Yeah,
completely different. It's not. I wouldn't say it's a different idea of music, but it's just it's a different world. Like it's a different world. And for me, I think a lot of people, the gateway for Indian music was the Beatles. Just the Beatles, and I heard
yeah,
I had known Indian music, but not in depth. But when I heard Within You Without You, that's an amazing piece of music. That whole piece. You know that story
yeah.
about Jeff Emerick cut a bar off that, and it angered a lot of the classical Indian people because they cut a bar off the kind of 12 bar of it at one point.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Oh,
I
okay,
thought
I
that was
didn't know
quite
that.
quite
I didn't
quite
know that.
quite interesting.
But it was interesting for me that I didn't. One thing I didn't know until I started researching
Mm,
the book was that, it was obvious if you listen to it, but I hadn't sort of thought it through. But the tracks, the Indian tracks, the George Harrison's tracks on Revolver,
mm.
there are no other Beatles on those tracks.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
They're basically just George and the Indian musicians.
Yeah,
And the same with the track on Sergeant Pepper.
yeah,
There's no Beatles on it.
no,
There's just
no.
George
Yeah,
and the
that's interesting.
Indians. And the Beatles the other Beatles were so impressed with it, and they liked it, and they loved the way it turned out. So they said, sure, put it on, we'll have it on the record. I mean, they could have, you could imagine in some groups, the group collective saying,
Yeah,
well, wait a minute, we're not even on this.
yeah, yeah,
How
yeah,
we can't, you put it on your own solo album. Don't put it on our group album.
yeah.
But but they were, and the other quote that I loved putting into the book was Paul McCartney, after he organized a group listening session for the four of them to sit down and listen to a Ravi Shankar raga beginning to end.
Mm.
And at the end, when he lifts the needle off, he turns to the group and he says, did anyone else notice that they didn't change keys? And it's oh, yeah, as you say, it's a whole different way of playing music. It's
Yeah,
scale based.
yeah.
It's not Western harmony,
Mm,
chord progressions. There are no chord progressions.
mm.
And that influence went everywhere. It shaped the music of John Coltrane and the Grateful Dead and Shakti and so many. I mean, that whole modal way of playing became part of part of the language of Western music.
Yeah, like even like I don't know, but it influenced Kind of Blue, but I know that's a modal kind of record, but that yeah, it's that just different way of playing on.
Yeah, kind of blue is very modal.
Yeah, yeah,
And
it's
then right after that, Coltrane made My Favorite Things,
yeah,
which is very kind of applying a lot of like playing the soprano sax like as if it was a Chennai,
mm,
you know, and long stretches of that are very modal.
yeah. I had never heard
Yeah,
about Ravi's brother Uday until your book. It was quite interesting the story about
right.
him. It's
Yeah,
really yeah, it's
yeah.
kind of like, and he's like, was he like 20 years older than Ravi?
Well, yeah, yeah. And Ravi, and there's so many stories in life, so many people, and so many historical figures that you see children repeating a pattern from their parents, even though they object to what their parents did or the way their parents treated them or whatever, they repeat it. And Ravi was brought up by a father who, basically went to the West, took a new wife in the West, left his Indian wife behind, came back for occasional visits, and Ravi was the product of the last of those conjugal visits. And so then he married Aladdin Khan's daughter, who was very unworldly, like his mother was, very Indian, very, very never traveled outside, and realized that he didn't want to be, a faithful husband to one woman. And he was set to travel to the West, and he had his mind set on a vision of a career in the West. And but he didn't want to just fudge it the way his father did. So that's why he stayed. He turned down the first offer and sent Ali Akbar Khan to do the concert in New York instead of him. And because he didn't want to repeat the patterns that his father, and he made it a point from that point on, once he divorced his Indian wife, he made a point of telling every woman that he got involved with, I'm not yours, I'm free. You can't expect any loyalty from me at all.
Right. Right.
You're not my steady girl.
Yeah.
This is just the way it is,
Yeah.
and take it or leave it. And he was like that for 30, 40 years until he finally married Anushka's mother when he was 70 or something.
Wow. She's a great sitar player.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. And Nora Jones, I couldn't believe when I was like reading something about Nora Jones like years ago, and I was like, her father's Ravi Shankar. I was like, how is it was
yeah.
I was crazy when I
For a
found it.
long time, Nora's mother
Yeah.
and Anushka's, they're basically the same age.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So they were conceived at about the same time, and so, but he did that, and he had another one in India. He had Anushka's mother was in London, Nora's mother was in America, and he had another girlfriend in India. And when he went from one continent to the other, he, you know, had the whatever one waiting for him,
As you
and
do.
as you do, yeah.
So he was kind of like a really like a rock star in a lot of ways because he's hanging out with rock stars. He kind of behaved almost rock star like with the women.
Yeah, although, but in a very indie, I mean, I don't think he certainly, he was very disapproving of, the one, he was fascinated, his first real encounter with rock stars, uh, uh, he'd met the Beatles, he met George Harrison. He was shocked at how humble and intelligent and respectful George Harrison was.
Mm,
He didn't expect that.
mm.
But his first real encounter with the music live in place was at Monterey.
Oh, the
And
runaway pop. Okay.
yeah, and he did a Sunday afternoon raga, and that's how Monterey Pop began. Actually, it was an idea for a afternoon raga by Ravi, and then somebody had the idea that, well, if all these people are going to, because he was so big with the kind of hippie generation in San Francisco, if all these people are going to come hear Ravi in the afternoon, let's put on something in the evening with local bands. And everybody said, yeah, yeah, yeah. We want it from Sunday evening to Saturday and then Friday, and then became the Monterey Festival. And he was very impressed with a lot of the music. He stayed for the whole festival, I think, and he listened to everybody. And he was really impressed, I think, with a lot of the people he saw. But he was horrified by Townsend and Hendrix
Right.
breaking their guitars, because
Yeah.
to him, an instrument is a holy thing. And there was a detail that I picked out from one of George's interviews, I think, that which I loved was that once when he was giving George a master class at his house, and George was playing the sitar, and the phone rang, and he put the sitar down, and he stepped over the sitar to get to the phone. And Ravi was beside himself. He said, "You never step over the sitar." You know,
Yeah.
I mean, a combination of respect and also not risking stepping on it.
Yeah, they're delicate. I have one.
Yeah, it's delicate.
Yeah.
And so, and to see Hendrix squirting lighter fluid on his guitar and throwing a match on it was just horrific to Robbie. You know,
Yeah.
this disrespect for his instrument. That was
Yeah.
the one thing he couldn't get used to.
Yeah. Did he like Hendrix though, musically?
I don't know. I mean, I don't have any direct quotes
Mm.
about Robbie, but he loved Coltrane. Although,
You could
and he
see why he
listened to
loves
all
Coltrane though.
he and John Coltrane became very good friends. And Coltrane's second son is called Robbie.
Yeah.
And but he also was perplexed by what he perceived as the anger in a lot of Coltrane's music in the later 60s.
Yeah.
And you know, Coltrane, a black American, had a lot to be angry about. And he also made beautiful records, very soulful ballad records, Coltrane. But he also made these sheets of sound, you know, very aggressive
Yeah.
records.
Yeah.
And Robbie was fascinated by them, but also perplexed because he never felt that music was a medium for expressing anger. That
Mm.
you know, Indian music wasn't designed. It
Yeah.
wasn't. You know, its purpose wasn't the opposite. Its purpose was spirituality and peace, and you know. So anyway, but anyway, that's
That's interesting though, because you know how different people. I can get what he means because if you're practicing that your whole life, that your way of thinking what music is as well. When you hear someone doing something that can be angry and aggressive, it would be kind of a bit jaunting to you. Because even kind of sometimes now when I hear certain rap music that's very like misogynistic and stuff like that, I just don't get that. It doesn't. For me,
yeah,
I'm not saying music has to be about love, but there's something about that where it's a bit more misogynistic and about like not all rap music, but there's a certain type or about like how much money you have and all that stuff. I can't get that. I just don't get that.
yeah, yeah.
You know.
Well, you know, but you know, I think one thing I also have learned over the years is that one of music's most important functions
Mm.
is to annoy the older generation.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's an Oedipal weapon, music, and it always has been. You know, and so I think for a lot for young people in that hormonal, you know, tempest of teenage and early 20s years, um, if if the music is accepted and understood and embraced by their parents' generation, it's somehow a failure.
Were your parents did they approve of music that you listened to when you were younger? Were they like, oh no, what's that noise?
No, no, they well, they were different. My mother had some. I mean, she didn't have a big collection, but I never forgot. I listened when I was a kid. I loved this group of records that she had. She might have had more, but the ones I remember: Edith Piaf, Carmen Miranda, Marlene Dietrich, and she also had some Bing Crosby and stuff like that. Um, but those exotic ones, you know, Piaf and Dietrich and Carmen Miranda, I love those, and she embraced. You know, she loved. She really. I mean, she never really loved the music my brother and I listened to, blues and jazz, and then rock
Hmm.
and roll. But she liked it, and she embraced our affection for, our enthusiasm for it. My father listened to music constantly. He worked a lot at home. He was running a small business, and he loved on the weekends. He would do the accounts to music. But for him, like Mahler was too avant-garde. You
Oh
know,
wow, that's
Mahler was
interesting.
too modern.
That's
I
interesting.
mean, he kind of went from Baroque through Beethoven into the Romantic composers and pretty much ground to a halt around Schumann
Okay,
and
okay.
Brahms.
So no
You know,
Charles Ives.
Brahms, Schumann, yeah, no Charles Ives, and certainly no Schoenberg.
Yeah.
And you know, and he just, you know, he was just like that was like a line in the sand. You didn't get, you know, um, I mean, he kind people would try and interest him in Mahler and Richard Strauss and things, and he was like, no, 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 I'm too weird for me. So he approved in theory of what I was doing. I mean, he was a kind of quixotic entrepreneur, and so he, identified with me starting a record label or a production company or something like that, and was supportive. But he didn't embrace the music itself. When I went
Right.
to a music with my dad, it was like the Handel Oratorio or St. Matthew Passion, or we'd go
That's
to those.
amazing. I'd love if my dad went to that.
Yeah,
That's amazing.
yeah.
Yeah, I would love that. Wow, that's cool. That's an education though. Like, so what age were you then going to those concerts?
Well, that was more in my teens when I went with him. But when I was young, my his mother
Mm,
was a pianist. His mother actually had been. She grew up in Cincinnati and was a kind of prodigy. And she played the Tchaikovsky piano concerto with the Cincinnati Symphony at age 14,
wow.
and then was packed off to Vienna to study with Leschetizky, who was the teacher of Arthur Schnabel and people like that.
Mm,
And she ended up later working in Berlin for Schnabel as an assistant before the First World War, sort of
wow.
1910 to 12 or 1909 to 1912, where they were like, he had like two or three assistants who would prepare the students. They would work with the student on a piece. And then when the piece was ready, or I think once a month, they would play the piece for the master, and he would
Okay.
critique the performance and then send them
Okay.
back to work with the. And so my grandmother was one of those assistants. And so I grew up, when I was a little kid, I used to sit under the piano and listen to her play Chopin and stuff like that. So she was a real Victorian sensibility. She played her Chopin kind of dripping with retards, and very, she was very straight laced as a woman,
Mm.
but full of passion and
Yeah.
sentimentality and stuff as a pianist, which was the Victorian mode, I think.
Yeah.
And so I had a lot of that around me as a kid.
That's cool. I heard that. Have you ever heard that story about Debussy? It's this his last. They found a Debussy piece in like 2001, and it was sold in Paris, and it was written after his etudes. It was called Evenings Lit by the Burning Coals, and it was it was 1917, so it was during World War One, and he was so cold that this guy that bought him all this coal to warm him up, he wrote this piece as a present to him, which I thought was pretty cool. Like, I
Okay,
only heard that the other day. I
cool.
was like, oh, that's a cool story, man.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I love Debussy. Lemaire is just amazing, man. He's
yeah,
got some
yeah.
amazing stuff. Yeah. How did you get into going from like loving music to kind of working with Pink Floyd on Arna Lane? Like, how did that happen?
Well, I mean, I think when I was when I was 15 or 16,
Hmm.
I had a little sliver of unrealistic fantasy that I would be a baseball player. I love
Okay.
baseball, and
Right.
I was, but I was never that good. I mean, I always felt like if the coach would just give me a chance, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I was always like the pinch hitter or the substitute or something. And one day and meanwhile I was listening to music all the time,
Mm.
just constantly listening to music. And one day we were having practice before the big game, and I wasn't taking batting practice. I was out in the field catching the balls for the first team.
Okay.
So I was like a reserve. And I was near a dormitory. It was in a boarding school. And somebody opened the window of a dorm room, and they had the local top 40 station tuned in on the radio. And I heard Walk into New Orleans by Fats Domino
Oh,
coming
cool.
out of the window.
That's cool.
And in that moment, I mean, remember, this was 1959, something like that.
Right.
There were very few books about this music. There wasn't, and there were books about jazz, but there was very little about blues. And there certainly wasn't much about the process, the producers, all of that. But I'd read a book about um, the country blues by Sam Charters, which showed this character, Ralph Peer, who was a producer for Victor Records, who went into the South and set up in hotel rooms and recorded blues singers and country singers and jug bands and all this.
Mm.
And I just thought to myself, wow, I, I was born way too late, because I would love to have been Ralph Peer.
Yeah.
And uh, and then, and my brother and me and a guy called Jeff Moldor, who you may have heard of, who was a singer with Butterfield and different bands. And the three of us would listen to blues and jazz at weekend afternoons. And then we would go to parties and we danced to Chuck Berry and Little Richard and doo-wop and stuff like that. And we never really talked about what we did in the afternoon to girls, for example, because it seemed a bit nerdy. It was a bit, to be listening to Sleepy John Estes records and Robert Johnson or Louis Armstrong's Hot Five wasn't as sexy as talking about Chuck Berry. And it was like the two things were kind of separate. They were really two separate things. And in that moment, in the outfield, hearing Fats Domino walking to New Orleans, it all came together in that moment. Like I realized that Fats Domino, oh, walking to New Orleans. Of course, I read somewhere that he's from New Orleans. He's from
Okay.
New Orleans, like Jelly Roll Morton.
Yeah.
So it's a continuum. It's not separate.
Yeah.
It's a continuum. And so the music we dance to that's on the top 40 is just like the stuff we listen to in the afternoons, only modern.
Yeah.
And so I could still be Ralph Peer, you know, and so because it somehow the ideas just meshed in that moment. And the bonus was that if I become a record producer, all the guys on the first team, the baseball team that are keeping me on the bench, will be jealous.
Yeah, okay. Slight
So
revenge.
in that moment, yeah, revenge. So in that moment, at age 16 or 17, I decided I would be a record producer.
Wow. That's cool, man.
So everything from that point on was aimed at being a record producer.
Ah. You know, there's a lot of people I know, like myself as well. It's like they remember these moments of like with music that go, that was a big moment for me. Or like there's, these kind of moments. I find that, it doesn't matter what kind of music people are into. There's a kind of moment where people go, that was a big moment for me. And it can kind of
Yeah,
change the trajectory of like certain things
yeah.
and like that. What was it like working with Pink Floyd? Like Sid Barrett, he must have been interesting character.
Well, it was. I mean, it was.
I
I
suppose he
mean,
wasn't
I
so far gone by then. He was just, it
no,
was
no.
the start of it.
He was great. He was a bit quiet compared to some of the others, but um, I met them, I guess, in August, September of '66,
Hmm.
and I was friends with Peter Jenner and Andrew King, who had just started managing them, and then I was involved with the London Free School, which was this sort of idealistic, weird left wing organization, and we decided to raise money with a concert, with a benefit concert.
Uh-huh.
And Jenner said, "Well, the Pink Floyd are looking for a place to play and get some exposure. They'll play for the benefit for you."
Mm.
And so was that was September of '66, and the first time I saw them, and by that time I'd met them, and Sid was a very sweet guy, and anyway, they played like three or four benefits for the free school,
Right.
and I thought they were great. And so I brought Chris Blackwell down to see them, and he didn't get it all. He still laughs about that. And I brought down a wonderful guy called Horst Schmaltzy, who was the head of A&R for Polydor,
Mm.
and he went, "Great, okay, let's sign them." And so we set up this. I set up my company, Witch Season Productions, was actually set up to record Pink Floyd for Polydor.
Oh, wow.
And we had the whole deal set. Everything was negotiated. Everything was ready. All we needed was a signature, four signatures. And Jenner called me up one day and said, um, "We've got an agent now who's going to book the group." And by this time, I'd started the UFO Club with Hoppy, who was the real leader of the London Free School. And we started this once a week event at an Irish dance hall in London,
Okay.
where on the Thursday and the Saturday was show bands,
Okay, that's cool.
and Friday was UFO,
Okay.
and uh, and so all while we were setting this up, I was trying to nail this deal to record Pink Floyd, and we actually were in. Polydor had a little demo studio in their offices, and we booked it, and we went in there to rehearse Arnold Lane. And Jenner called me up and said, "We have a new agent, and the agents are coming down to meet the group at the rehearsal, this rehearsal." And so they came in, and it's a funny memory because, and I write about this in White Bicycles, that these guys walked in the room, and they were like East End, working class, tough guys who
Hmm.
were bookers,
Okay.
music bookers. They were part of this, this new world of rock bands, and you know, and and the irony is that all three of them, in later, much later, became really good friends of mine.
Okay.
But but when they walked in that first time, I froze because I said,
Uh,
"Oh fuck, I'm in trouble now," because I could just see them looking around like, "Wait a minute, we need what's this?" And Polydor was established through they gave label deals. They had the Bee Gees through Reaction Records. They had Hendrix through Track Records. They had the Who. They had the biggest groups, but they were all like labeled as they didn't have an image. Polydor didn't have an image,
right, right.
and anyway, the agents Brian Morrison, Tony Howard, and Steve O'Rourke, who later became their manager, um, they sort of listened to what we were doing, went away, and the next day I got a call from Jenner saying we're not signing the contract,
Oh no.
and because basically because Brian Morrison had said we can get you a much bigger deal with EMI,
Right.
and so of course EMI was the Beatles label, and it was like
Yeah.
the biggest you
Yeah.
know and so they said, but what we were going to do is the agency would finance the first single, and
Okay.
we'd like you to
Okay.
produce the single because you've already done the work with it, you're prepared, they want to work with you. And I said, but wait a minute, if I produce the single and that helps you get through the deal, can I be locked in
Yeah.
as the producer of the album for the next single? And they came back and said, well, no, EMI won't want to be, want to have their hands tied. um, we'll give you a royalty on the single, whatever you produce. And I said, well, I'm not going to do it then. And there was this standoff that lasted about 4 days where
Yeah.
they kept saying, well, come on, Joe, don't be so silly, just do it. Well, you'll be their producer. Don't worry, but we can't put it in writing. It's too much.
Uh,
And of course, what I didn't realize, and what I think Brian Morrison knew, was that EMI's policy in those days was totally in house.
yeah, I get you.
Like
Yeah.
everything was made at Abbey Road with Abbey Road engineers and Abbey Road producers.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so we made Arnold Lane. EMI loved it, put up, what seemed like a huge amount of money at the time, £5,000.
Jeez, that's a
And
lot in the 60s. Holy shit.
yeah,
Wow.
and signed them. And then, of course, they put out the record. It was a hit, a modest hit. And they said, you know, uh, you're not going to produce it. Our in-house team is going to produce it.
Man.
So, um, so that was a bit of a choker. But anyway, um, it sent me out there. I had the Incredible String Band who were doing really well then.
Hmm.
I was producing them, and then I signed Fairport Convention and Richard Thompson, and kept going.
You did that amazing Nick
But
Drake
Sid was
record.
great.
That Nick
Yeah,
Drake record, Five Leaves Left,
yeah,
man. That's such a beautiful
yeah,
record. He was such a talent, man. You
yeah,
know,
yeah,
his voice was amazing.
yeah. Oh, he was remarkable, but nobody got it. People just didn't get it.
At the time, they
You
didn't get
know,
it, no?
Well, no, at the time. Later they got it, but at the time,
It's so
that's really
weird.
just
How did they
well. But
not? How did they
in a
not
way,
get that?
you can kind of understand it. It's very different from everything else at that time. You know, it's this strange mixture of influences that is not, there weren't that many singer-songwriters around at that time. I mean, and the big ones, Dylan, Paul Simon, James Taylor. You there's this blues feeling. America kind of defined, and there was Donovan, who was the sort of
Hmm.
most British
Hmm.
singer-songwriter in a way. And there's a little bit of linkage. You can feel a little bit of influence, but I think Donovan just had a whole different ethos that he was tapped into. And Nick, it was mysterious to me where Nick came up with his ideas, but then when I heard his mother's tapes years later after he died, I went, that explains a lot. His mother composed songs on the piano,
Oh,
and she used these. If you've never heard Molly
no.
Drake, you should check her out on
Oh, I will.
Spotify. She's fantastic,
Oh, wow. I'm gonna
and she
definitely do
was
that.
his mother. She's his mother, Nick's mother, and she never performed in public. She just made tapes at home.
Oh,
And if you listen to, and she was sort of coming out of a world that was shaped by Noel Coward and Flanders and Swan and people like that. And she had her own. She was pretty self-taught, and she had her own shapes on the
uh-huh,
chords.
uh-huh.
And if you listen to Nick's guitar after listening to a few songs of Molly Drake, you realize that all those weird tunings that he used on the guitar were his attempt to recreate the
Ah,
chord shapes that Molly had on the piano on his
cool.
guitar. I think it's very influential what his mother was doing,
That's interesting.
and it solves some of the mysteries of where did that come from? Where did Nick
Ah,
bring from? But what he was doing was definitely, I don't know, the whole singing quietly. I mean, Leonard Cohen had just come out with his first album,
uh-huh.
and I thought, well, if Leonard Cohen could do it, because I knew Nick didn't want to perform really. But we didn't really have what Leonard Cohen had in America, which was this free form FM radio,
Mm-hmm.
and so we didn't have. I had David Geffen really liked the Nick records,
Uh-huh.
and I kept pulling his coat, like, "Come on, David, he was in the process of forming Asylum Records,
Ah,
and if we
okay.
could have gotten Nick on Asylum, that would have been great." But he kept saying, "Well, I need to see him perform," And I said, "Well, come on over. We'll set up a thing for you or whatever." But somehow it just never transpired. And then, um, anyway, sad story.
Yeah, yeah. What a talent, man. What a talent. Back to your book. I never knew that whole thing with my Malcolm McLaren when he basically like stole, like put himself as like songwriter credit when he essentially stole the music when he went over to Africa. That was like
Well, I
crazy,
mean,
man.
I
Well, not stole, but
I
you know what
have
I mean.
actually, yeah. I mean, I have listened to some of the things. I mean, I read a lot of accounts of this,
Yeah,
and it's a little tenuous, but still, he basically. I mean, he's not a composer, Malcolm McLaren. He's never
yeah,
composed a tune in his
yeah,
life,
yeah.
and and he went into the studio in South Africa and did what Paul Simon did.
Mm,
He got tracks. He laid down tracks, and Paul, though, kept clear track of whose melody it was, and he gave people shares based on their contribution. And some of the South African musicians made a lot of money from their role in Graceland, and
yeah.
he paid them really well at the
Rightfully
time for the
so.
sessions. But Malcolm didn't, and also Malcolm's, it's just it's a bit. I mean, I don't know. I met Malcolm McLaren once. He seemed
Mm,
like a nice enough guy, but the whole ethos of what he was trying to do just is so, it's like, in a way, that comparison between Malcolm and Paul Simon kind of sets up a theme that runs through the book,
yeah, yeah,
which is that if you treat the music well, if you record it well, and you mix it with respect, and you celebrate its roots, connections, and its rhythm, and you don't try and dilute it and make it land it in the middle of the Atlantic between wherever it comes from and America, you know, you'll do better than trying to make some sort of fusion that doesn't quite work.
Hmm.
And and so the fact that Malcolm McLaren's, in a way, the more telling contrast between Malcolm McLaren and Paul Simon is, I mean, how they treated the musicians is kind of important,
Yes.
but even more important is the fact that Malcolm McLaren flopped
Yeah.
and Paul Simon sold millions and millions of records.
Yeah.
And he sold those records by tapping into the music with great respect,
Hmm.
particularly for the rhythm.
Hmm.
And he had done that before. He did it with Mother and Child Reunion, where he went to Jamaica and said,
Yeah.
okay, show me let's play something. Here's some chord changes. Let's see what rhythm works and your rhythm, what rhythm of yours, what Jamaican feel works with these chord changes.
Hmm.
And and then he wrote the lyrics afterwards, inspired by the rhythm,
Mm. Mm.
which is different from the way most fusion records happen,
Yeah. They
where, I mean,
start with the
the
melody.
most, yeah, and also, or you start with a sync pulse,
Hmm.
you know, and a click track, and uh, the most extreme example being One Giant Leap. I don't remember if you remember that record.
Yeah.
It had a lot of publicity back in the late '80s or whenever it was, and basically it was like they put down a click track and a bass part, I think.
Hey.
And then they went around the world going into the studio with people and asked them to sing over it or play a melody instrument over this bed. And so the whole album, from beginning to end, and film that they made as they made it, is with this mid Atlantic kind of beat, just like a
Right.
neutral, culturally
Generic kind of.
non existent beat with all these crazy, interesting vocals and melody instruments and flutes and saxophones and guitars and stuff on top of it. And I always felt like that's like when you drop a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and it lands face down. It's the wrong way around. It's like it sounds much better if you if you start with the most successful records of so-called world music
Mm.
have really had rhythm, the local rhythm, as a fundamental part of what they're doing. And anyway, that's just my particular axe to grind that is
Yeah.
like a little subtext running through the book.
It's funny, when I've seen I'll say Western artists when they always say, "Oh, I like," they're talking about things that inspire them, and they say African music, and you're like, that's fairly broad. I mean, like Senegal music
Yeah,
rhythms are very different than South African rhythms.
yeah.
So like, it's quite funny when they go just African music. It's like it's a completely like
European is like
yeah,
European music.
exactly. There's so much different, Bulgarian music is different than
Yeah,
Irish music and stuff like that. So it's quite kind of interesting when you hear a lot of modern kind of hipster bands, if they're ever kind of like touting that, they
yeah,
always go African music, and you're like, well, what country are you
yeah.
talking about? You know what I mean? I actually seen a cool, where I'm from. I'm
Right.
from this
Yeah,
little
yeah.
tiny place in the west of Ireland, and we don't get much concerts here, but there was a kora player, a Senegal kora player, a few months ago playing in town. It was amazing. It's really
Mm.
Sakatu with oh geez, I can't. I'm not going to even say his name, but yeah, he was.
Sissoko?
Yeah,
Was he a
Sissoko. Yeah, yeah,
Sissoko?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, that's a family name of kora players in
yeah.
Senegal.
I think it was Sakota Kita. I think was his name.
Oh,
Kita.
okay, Keita. Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
really talented
Uh,
dude. Like,
yeah. So where do you live, near Galway or?
no, no, I live in Sligo. It's like a tiny little It's like kind of close to Galway, maybe 2 hours away. It's more on the
What is it? South of Galway.
no, it'd be north of Galway, so I'd be
Okay.
closer to Donegal, that kind of area.
Right.
We're
Right.
kind of
Okay. Okay.
way west,
Okay.
but
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, it was
Yeah.
interesting getting music here. You wouldn't get too much. You kind of had to, find what you get. But I thought that was kind of cool of like when you're younger, which I don't know how you feel about this, but when I was younger, I could afford like one record. Like that was kind of it. I'd have to save for me CD or me tape like that. And I think
Yeah.
nowadays, when you have too much music, I don't know, is that good for you when you're kind of making music or listening? Because there's actually too much choice. Do you think that's a good or a bad
Yeah.
thing? Yeah?
I think I listen. I totally agree with that. One of my favorite anecdotes that I tell um, often in interviews. So I apologize to anyone who's heard me tell this before. Um, I read years and years ago. I can't remember how long, like 30 years ago or something. I read an interview
Hmm.
with Keith Richards, and he talked about when he first moved into a kind of like a bed sit with Mick. They had this real kind of funky little, very small flat or room in Fulham
Right.
when they were just starting to form the Stones. They were starting to play in the Railway Tavern and all this kind of stuff. And I mean, I'm sure he was probably exaggerating, but as you know, but the story that he told was that they had one of the little dance set record players, like a little small record player that could play a 45.
Uh-huh.
And so they had a I don't know if you ever heard of the Stateside label. It was a
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
was a label that was a subsidiary of EMI,
Yeah.
and they licensed mostly R&B from American independent labels and released them. And they put out EPs, which was basically like a 45 RPM single with two tracks on one side and two tracks on the other, 7 inch. And they had a record that was licensed from the Nashboro label, which was based in Nashville, and it was a blues label. And they had two tracks by Slim Harpo on one side and two tracks by Lazy Lester on the other side.
Cool.
And I know this EP.
Yeah.
I used to own this EP, and I know those tracks. I think "I'm a King Bee" was one of the tracks on Slim Harpo, and if you listen to it, and you listen to early Stones, it's like the early Stones is a kind of South London take on the Nashboro blues style.
Hmm.
It's a very distinctive, drawling, laid back, funky, but not too energetic kind of R&B. And it was the only record they had. And they used to play it over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And until they wore it out so bad that they couldn't play it anymore.
Mm.
And and I always think that's such a great lesson because I think if Mick and Keith had been sitting in their little bedsit in Fulham with a computer and Spotify, and they could have gone and listened to the entire Howling Wolf, the entire Robert Johnson, the entire Muddy Waters, the entire B.B. King, the entire Charlie Patton, you know,
Yeah.
they wouldn't have sounded as quirky and distinctive and unique as the Stones did.
Yeah.
And that the narrowness of their blues exposure was a key factor in forming their sound.
Yeah.
And I think that people who start out with that interest today can hear everything, and it's too much.
Yeah.
It homogenizes the influence,
I totally agree.
and yeah. So anyway, that's just. But what can we do? That's the way. That's the way. the world
Yeah,
is right now.
it's kind of it's strange. Even I know you were saying about it earlier about click tracks, and I think that's such a different way to do music because you listen to old records and like they speed up in the chorus and they slow down, they speed up, like and that
Yeah,
kind of a lot of music is about time and about
yeah,
color and stuff like that. And I think the whole advent of click tracks and there's this obsession that everything has to be to a grid and everything has to be in time and everything. Like I adore the Beach Boys and I love the Beach Boys. I think they're one of the greatest harmony bands. But even some of their stuff you can hear not. I mean, it's not complete. There's odd bits where it's slightly off, but that's what's cool. Like everything has
yeah,
to be like so in tune now, and it kind of I don't know. It
yeah.
it, it
And also, it's not just even speeding up and slowing down. It's there's like moments of greater intensity
yeah, yeah,
that just suddenly like the bass player and the drummer lock in,
yeah.
and they just pick it up just a hair. And you can't. I mean, okay, somebody says, "Well, yeah, I can program that." I can push a button and say, "Pick it up a hair."
Yeah.
you know, but it's not the same.
No.
And I would always tell people who say, well, what difference does it make? It doesn't, it's all, if it's in time, there's nothing wrong with that. I would just say, listen to Try Little Tenderness by Otis Redding. And if that record, it starts out with just vocal and guitar, I think.
Mm.
And then the keyboard starts to come in. And every time another instrument enters, the kind of feeling shifts. And then it gets more and more intense and it builds up. And finally when Otis goes and try a little tenderness, tenderness, everybody's charging forward. And you couldn't do that in a million years with a click track.
No. 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 You can't.
It's
It's
just, it
it's
wouldn't happen. It wouldn't happen.
no.
And it's one of the great musical moments that we have on record. It's an incredible record.
You know that story about sitting on the dock of the bay, Otis Redding thing? He was like listening to like Sergeant Pepper for months before that song. I thought that
Yeah.
was I was like, whoa, that's cool, man. I was so
Yeah.
interested in it.
Yeah.
And then they released it after he died. But I just thought, wow, we listened to I would have never got that from that. But that's what's so cool
Yeah.
about it. He took something but then made it into
Yeah.
something its own, which I think is such a amazing thing.
Yeah. No, well, I mean, I think that's the story that I tell in the book. All over the world, music is connected.
Mm.
Everybody listens to other stuff. And before 1925, most of that was geographical, was like people hearing what was being played in the culture next door and having that influence them.
Yeah.
Um, but 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 it's speeded up. I mean, this is a dilemma about technology. At the beginning in the late 20s, technology was an incredible thing. That the way that it because we had electrical recordings, and so records that really popped, that really
Mm.
sounded good
Mm.
on a record player. And suddenly you had like Hawaiian guitar all over the world.
That's brilliant.
you know, African Congolese rumba with guys playing with open tuning guitars and trying to sound Hawaiian, and Indian raga being played on a lap guitar with a bar running back and forth. The Hawaiian sound swept, and it already swept America, but just through touring, through tent shows and vaudeville shows that had a Hawaiian act.
Ah, right.
And people, that's where the blues singers got the bottleneck, was from the Hawaiians.
Yeah, yeah.
And and so and that's just one example. I mean, there's just everywhere you turn, you hear, you can tell, this guy heard something from the other side of the world, or more likely from next door,
Yeah,
from the white and black crossover in America,
yeah.
the Cuban American crossover in New Orleans, the the American African crossover in Jamaica, all these things, are
Mm.
just music is mongrel by definition. You know, it's always crossbreeding.
Hmm. Hmm. You in the book you talked about Brazilian music, and my girlfriend, she's from Brazil, so
Okay.
she got me let me see, where's this record? Hold on. Oh, she got me this for Christmas. It's I don't know. Do you know? Can you see that?
Oh yeah.
But
Oh cool.
Joe Band did all the Antonio Carlos
Yeah.
Joban did all the arrangements on it,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I
Jobim.
had
Yeah.
I had known, like, Girl from Ipanema, but his arrangements on that, his orchestral arrangements are amazing. Like,
Yeah.
they're brilliant. Like,
He
they're just so brilliant. You know?
he was an incredible guy.
Yeah,
He was um um you know, he he did a record with Sinatra.
yeah.
Sinatra called him up and did a whole record of his songs with his arrangements. You know, and he was a brilliant arranger. And you know, it's he was he loved Brazilian rhythms. He loved Brazilian music. But at his piano where he composed, he had a bust of Chopin. You know,
That's
so
interesting.
he was, you know, tuning into both
Yeah,
frequencies, you know, the European classical influence, the Brazilian rhythmic influence, and um, you know, he was no, I mean, you know, that's and that story you hear it again and again and again. And those anyway, that was the in a way the trigger for the book was to tell these stories about these characters because we know we have so many great books about Elvis, about the Beatles, about James Brown, about Sam Cooke,
mm,
about Jarvis Cocker. You know,
mm.
we've got lots of books to read about Anglo American music, and I just thought, well, hey, wait a minute. I think the rest of the world should get that treatment. You know, that sort of new journalism, fun to read nonfiction.
Yeah, yeah, man. It's such a
That
super interesting book, dude. It's so like I said to you at the start, you have to you can't read it once and take it all in because there's so much in it. Like even I like there's so many little stories about like the Russian guy who heard "Girl" by the Beatles, and then Paul Simon
yeah,
was singing "Graceland" to you in your ear. Just great stories. Like it's
yeah.
like that's amazing. And just I know you went in talking about Senegal music and stuff like that, and I went back and listened to some of that stuff. And how long did it take you to write that book? It must took you.
17 years.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
Like,
not full time,
yeah,
but
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. So would you write that like chapter by chapter, or would you go
yeah,
back, or would you?
yeah,
So okay.
yeah. Pretty much chapter by chapter. I went. I mean, I wrote the South African chapter and thought, okay, that's not bad.
Hmm.
Okay, and then I moved on, and I started to write the Cuban chapter, and then I thought, wow, this is a big one. This
Yeah,
is a daunting task. Cuba.
yeah,
Maybe I'll do something a bit easier, a bit more compact first.
yeah.
So I wrote the Argentine chapter, and then I went back and wrote the Cuban chapter, and then I went and read the Argentine chapter, and I went, oh man, this isn't good enough. This is lame. And I waited till I got up to. So I waited another year or so. I wrote the Jamaican chapter, and then I went back and rewrote started completely from scratch on Argentina again, and wrote that differently. And um, yeah, but I pretty much took each one as a chapter, you know. And then I'd finish a chapter, and then I just spend months reading about
Right,
the next chapter.
right.
Because I don't know if you look in the bibliography, there's a huge
Yeah,
bibliography. I did a
yeah,
lot of reading. I
yeah.
did a hell of a lot of reading, and so I had to organize all the material and take notes and put it all together.
Mm.
Um, uh, and then once I had all the research done, then I would start writing each
Okay,
chapter. I did it chapter by chapter,
okay.
and
Would you write in a
um,
computer, or would you use a typewriter?
yeah, no, I wrote. a computer.
Yeah.
I That's one technology. I don't know. I mean, I know I read interviews with writers, modern writers, who say they use a pad,
Walk
a
away with that.
legal pad,
No.
and they write that way, and then they transcribe it onto. But I don't know. To me, writing, the process, particularly of rewriting,
Hmm.
reminded me a lot of mixing.
Okay.
It's like if I had like a whole section, one of those sections that got the little dots in between. Okay, I've written this section on a certain subject. And then you start going through it sentence by sentence, taking out a word, adding another word,
Hmm.
leaving out one whole phrase, you know, saying, no, no, that sentence shouldn't open the second paragraph. I got to redo that. It's a bit like having, but you've got the basic text there,
Yeah.
but it just doesn't flow. It's not quite right. You got all the thoughts and the ideas, and you got some very nice phrases in there,
Hmm.
but it's not tight. It's not ready yet. And that process of getting it to the finished state, I found very similar to mixing.
Really?
The way that you would take, okay, well, that sounds pretty good, but that passage would just work better if the guitar was a hair brighter,
Yeah. Yeah.
or the rhythm guitar was a little up in the mix or a little warmer, or wait a minute, that drum mix seems a little bit out. We need a little more toms,
Hmm.
you know, and you just tweak it. And little by little, every time you play it back, it would sound better.
Yeah.
And eventually you can sit back and say, yeah, now that sounds like what I imagined it could sound like. And so then you do
Yeah.
the same. I would do the same with the rewriting those sections. Was I'd take a section and I'd say, okay, I've written it,
Mm.
but it's a little rough. It's not really the way I would want somebody to see it. So I've got to improve the first paragraph. I got to do this to the last paragraph. I got to make this clearer. You it was like mixing, and that sort of a detail, the way taking a word out would have the same effect as on a mix. Just bringing something down that clashes with the vocal a little bit.
Yeah.
Just dip it a little bit
Yeah.
under that word. Because suddenly it all pops into shape. Like, oh yeah, that sounds cool, and
Yeah.
oh, that reads nicely. So it's to me anyway. I don't know how if it's too much of a stretch to compare the two processes, but they definitely tapped into the similar part of my brain.
Yeah. I get what you mean totally. It's
Yeah,
what I was thinking about mixing, and I've talked this to my friends who's like made records, and mixing is so different nowadays because you
yeah,
mix different when you look at something. If you add like 10K and you're looking at an equalizer and you're adding 10K, you'll go, whoa, that's too much. But if you go to an equalizer like on a console or something like that and you add 10K, you're not thinking about it. You're like not looking at it. And I find that looking at things and not looking at things, it completely changes the way you kind of paint your mixes. It's a completely different process. And that's something I think that's probably bad with my generation of music. Is like it's very you're looking,
yeah,
and it's such a different thing if you're looking at something. Even if you notice when you look at a concert and listen to it, it's very different than listening to it and looking at it. If
yeah.
I'm making any sense, and probably not.
Well, and also I think I don't know whether this is the way you work as when you record, but having everything isolated is a very
Oh,
different process when you mix
yeah,
than because you know the great. I mean, people would come to me. I mean, when Nick Drake began to get popular,
yeah,
I started getting people who sought me out and would find my email address and send me an email saying, and these were very often people who'd come to Nick Drake through Pink Moon.
Uh-huh. Okay.
That was the first thing they'd heard,
Mm-hmm.
and then they heard Five Leaves Left or Brighter Later, and they thought, "What's all this shit? You know, all these strings and shit. You know, like we just want to hear Nick like on his own, like Pink Moon."
Okay.
And so they would write to me and say, are you going to release a version of Five Leaves Left with just voice and guitar, leaving off
Okay.
all the other stuff? And I would write back to them. I'd say, well, aside from the fact that I would never do that because Nick was very involved in
Yeah.
arrangements. I mean,
Yeah.
he was very much, he and Robert Kirby would sit together and work these out together. So
Okay.
wouldn't betray Nick's history that way.
Yes.
But also, just so you know, we couldn't do it. You know, Riverman was recorded with Nick sitting 3 feet from the strings,
So there's all that bleed.
and yeah, and playing as they recorded. It was all
Wow.
done in a room, so you
Wow.
couldn't actually say no.
Yeah.
And then, and the fact is that the sound that everybody admires and says is so beautiful on Riverman, for example, wouldn't be that way if everything had been isolated.
Mm-hmm.
You know, part of the whole way it works, the fact that it sounds so three-dimensional, is because you have so many mics open
Yeah. Yeah.
in the same room.
Yeah.
And so you not only are getting the mic for the viola that's sort of sitting above the viola, but you're getting another angle on the sound of the viola from the violin mic next door and from Nick's vocal mic behind them. You're
Yeah.
getting another. So you have all these, and so it helps give the illusion, not the reality, of course, but the illusion of three dimensionality.
Yeah. 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 That I
And
think that
you're never
so
going to
sorry.
get that if everybody's in a booth.
Yeah, that's kind of like we're going back talking about recording nowadays. It's like everything is recorded isolated.
Yeah,
There's such a different thing. Or even like I know you touched at the end of the book talking about drum machines and electronic music, and they're kind of taking a loop of something, we'll say, of an old record or something like that, is way different than them playing the whole song out as a band. It's a completely different kind of way
yeah,
and a different
yeah,
feel. And I think we're digitized music, or not digitized, but recording in DAW and all that stuff. We've kind of lost a lot of that feel of like of the way people just playing in a room, which is just amazing. I
yeah,
listen back to the Wrecking Crew and stuff like that, the way they played, and it wasn't always like tight. I did a video the other day where I deconstructed Good Vibrations and I recreated it,
yeah,
and they're playing quite like loose. They're not playing sloppy, but they're playing loose. They're playing
yeah,
different kind of things.
yeah,
I think we've
yeah.
kind of lost that a bit. So yeah. Anyways.
And I think I worry. I mean, I think it's just one of those facts of life that there's a whole generation of people who grow up dancing and listening
Mm.
to music that is absolutely metronomically regular. And so maybe a track like Try a Little Tenderness will sound weird to them,
Yeah, that's a good point.
because it's too slippery rhythmically.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Who knows? But I think definitely a lot of young people. I mean, I don't know. This is just anecdotal, but it seems like a lot of young people love, early Beatles, Stones,
Yeah.
Hendrix.
Yeah.
They go back and they discover that stuff. And so, anyway, let's hope they'll go back and discover early Joao Gilberto at the
Yeah.
same
Yeah.
time.
I've taken up so much of your time, man. Sorry for if I was rambling on too much. What are you up to these
That's all
days?
right. No,
Are you
no,
working? Are you working on another book? Or are you doing apart from you doing? I know you're doing
no,
the.
listen, I still have lots to do on this book. I just not too long, just before Christmas, I finished the audiobook, so that's up
I was listening to
for
that.
people, and I read it all myself, and
40
42
hours.
hours.
Yeah, I was about to say that. I was like,
Yeah,
whoa.
and and, and now I'm putting together this audio visual thing for Big Ears, so that's a big task,
Mm.
and and so we're going back. The paperback comes out in America in March. I'm going back to do some more events in America,
Hmm.
and um, so and I just some of it's been great. Like I mean, it's all been great. I just got back from Jaipur, the literary festival in India,
Wow.
and that was fantastic.
Yeah.
So if people want to invite me to India to come read from my book,
Yeah.
I'm there. So but I've also got a big task ahead of me because I rather rashly printed in the book that if you go to my website, you'll find playlists. And I have an ambition to do a really thorough playlist because Spotify, you can do playlists on Spotify, but a lot of what I talk about in the book is not on Spotify.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot. I was checking some of the others. Where the hell are these? You have
Yeah,
to, I have a
yeah.
few. I
And
had a
so I
few.
want to have
Yeah,
YouTube is where a lot more stuff can be found, and there's a lot of great material like live clips,
yeah,
documentaries,
yeah,
information. So I'm curating a list of all that stuff that people can follow as they read the book, but it's not up there yet. It's got a lot more work to be done.
yeah,
So that'll keep me busy for the next few months.
yeah, yeah. Have you gone to archive.org? They have loads of like crazy stuff you can find on that. It's like a site called archive.org where
Archive.org.
yeah, .org. So they've stuff that's archived
Okay,
from
I'll check that out.
yeah.
Yeah,
It's really cool. It's really cool.
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
uh,
Okay,
dude, thanks, Joe. Thanks very much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate your time.
pleasure.
Yeah, and I really dig the book.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure talking to you. And yeah, do you have have you always lived where you live? Is
I,
that where you
I
did you
lived in
just stay there or
I lived in Dublin for a few years, and yeah, that was enough for me. A
you
few
came
years in
back
Dublin.
home?
That's enough for me. A few
Okay.
years. So yeah, I don't know. I might move. I'm thinking of moving sometime. So God knows when. I moved to Berlin for a while, but that was just before COVID, and I was like, oh my God, COVID happened,
Right.
and I just moved, and I was like, oh, I had to move back home. So at some point,
So does your Brazilian girlfriend like rural Ireland?
she does. Yeah, she does. Yeah, she likes it. Like I live beside the beach, so it's kind of, you know,
Oh, nice. Yeah,
Brazil without the sun.
nice. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Right, Joe.
Okay.
Hey, thanks very much.
All right. All the
Take care,
best. Okay.
brother.
Bye bye. Bye
Thank you. Bye bye.
bye.